Labour has never done well in a UK election without doing really well in Scotland.
We need deposit ATMs and we need withdrawal ATMs, and we need a law that means that businesses have to accept cash.
UK workers have had the most bargaining power essentially since the 1970s because the jobs market is so tight.
Can Britain actually afford to maintain a global military presence?
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Well, the polls have closed, so at last we can talk about the by-elections. This was the first chance to take the temperature of the nation after party conferences and before the general election. Historic victories for Labour in 2 seats. Here's Keir Starmer celebrating in one of them, Mid Bedfordshire.
This is an incredible night in politics. It is clear that the voters here have turned their back on a failed Tory government. They've had enough of the decline of the last 13 years and they are crying out for change.
So, a triumphant Starmer, but the Conservative Party chair, Greg Hands, thinks that they can win back both seats at a general election.
I think we had a very good campaign. We had good candidates. We just need to find a way of incentivising Conservatives to turn up to vote next year for the general election. But I'm confident that we will be able to do that.
Now, we only do this on very special occasions, but joining us now is James Wilcock, the mastermind behind this podcast, who loves a little cephology. James, welcome to this side of the glass window in the studio. Now, James, the timing of these by-elections was no coincidence, and the thinking behind it seems to have had the intended effect.
I mean, I like that you get me out just for by-elections. It's like a little special time of the year, you know, it's Halloween's coming up. But what is interesting is, a year ago today, Liz Truss's lettuce was giving a press conference about how it had survived longer than her. And even now, the Conservatives are dealing with the fallback, they call them legacy issues of previous governments. I mean, Nadine Dorries, which was one of these seats, Mid Bedfordshire, where Keir Starmer was this morning, she was a cabinet minister not 18 months ago under Boris Johnson's administration. And she had been sitting on the seat, refusing to quit for a very long time, just so she could time it perfectly to ruin Rishi Sunak's post-conference sort of debut, where he was trying to reset his agenda. And that level of bitterness and infighting was something that has carried through onto the local doorsteps.
Yeah, I mean, pretty incredible. Look, in terms of the stakes then going into this, the wind in the sails for Keir Starmer, I mean, winning a by-election going into Labour conference, now winning 2, on the exit.
What has been really fascinating in the shift here is it was always Keir Starmer who used to have something to prove. And now, because of the shift in the polls, that weight has actually shifted onto Rishi Sunak now. And a lot of his party are the ones who are now demanding, where are the results? You've had your conference season. Many have said it went very well for Keir Starmer despite the glitter. When are we going to get kind of big election wins? When are we going to get policy? When is this sort of inspiring Boris Johnson-style leader figure going to emerge? Michael Fabricant was on the airwaves this morning saying, we had great candidates. Where was the government? Where was turnout? So the stakes for Sunak are now going to be, as Greg Hands put it just there, can we do this for a general election campaign? Is there a time now where they shed the skin of the old Tory administration and push out the new Rishi Sunak government?
Listen, I think that word legacy, I just want to say that is such a business term that has been adopted in some ways into political language. Legacy issues are one that business leaders usually talk about. So I quite like that crossover.
Well, we're going to delve deeper into the numbers and all those questions that you raised, James, next. But thank you for setting the scene. Well, to dig deeper into the numbers, we're joined now by Pollster Tom Lubbock, who is Founding Director at JL Partners. Tom, thanks for being with us. I don't know how much sleep you've had, but I wonder whether these results surprised you.
I think I was mildly surprised, yeah. The mid-bed result was always up in the air. It was always going to be a coin toss. And actually, at the end of the day, Labour did actually land it. It wasn't one of those squeaky bum time moments. They did actually land it without the need for a recount. There's plenty of margin there for them. So I was surprised that wasn't actually close in the end. And then Tamworth, I mean, I think that's the least surprising of the two results, but I think we'll get into more of why that is in a bit.
Yeah, but I mean, Bloomberg was reporting last week, Tom, that privately the Conservative Party did expect to hold the seat. So what were they missing? What didn't they get?
Yeah, I'm sure your listeners are political geeks like us, and I think they would be well advised to take reports of privately this and privately that, and especially private poll numbers. Private poll numbers are like the biggest red flag ever. So I just wouldn't take anything that is reported as kind of private from Labour or private for the Conservatives as serious. I mean, I'm not sure. I would imagine that both Labour and Conservatives expected this result in Tamworth from way out.
Okay, but what happened here? Let's break it down. Why did Labour do so well?
Yeah, I think you've got to look at the national polls to start with, because they do tell you what the baseline is for these seats. You look at the swing in the national polls, and whilst Labour has outperformed it by some margin here, it is a huge, huge swing that's taking place in the national polls from that 2019 result, Labour's worst result since 1935. And you look at the polls now, Labour are 18 points ahead on average in those national polls. So in some ways, what has happened here is that people just voted the way they told pollsters they were going to vote. People are massively dissatisfied with the government at the moment. And the Conservative brand is really a really low ebb. And you see that in by-elections are a kind of way that gets magnified and extrapolated into headline form, but it's already there in the national polls.
Look, it's really easy to reach for the 1997 comparison to Tony Blair. The only time in living memory when a Labour leader looked set to do as well. Is that really the right comparison? I mean, for example, Lord Mandelson just saying today, Labour have to not be too complacent. I mean, he said exactly the same thing when we saw him at Labour conference only a couple of weeks ago. Is 97 the right comparison?
I have to say, I've been very, very reticent in making that comparison, because the temptation, as you say, when you've got a low number of cases of something happening in the past, is to always reach for the one that is either most recent or if there's only a few on the shelf, you reach for the ones that are there. I have to say, these by-elections do have eerie echoes of that pre-97 period. I think your listeners might know that there was actually a Tamworth by-election in 1996, in that kind of period where it became astoundingly obvious to anyone watching that Tony Blair was going to win that 1997 general election, apart from perhaps him, although I think perhaps he was faking that uncertainty for electoral effect. But there was a Tamworth by-election in 1996, and it was a slightly different seat, but a 2 percentage point smaller swing than the one we just saw. So, I mean, it's hard to escape that conclusion. Dissatisfaction with the incumbent government. A Labour leader who isn't as popular now as Tony Blair was then, but we're not saying it's an identical situation. We're just saying a Conservative government with a very long record in government that has become very unpopular, and Labour is going to take over as the party. It looked on the basis of these results anyway. It would, if they were replicated on a majority of some size. The similarities are hard to escape.
Well, do you expect more Conservative MPs to quit if it looks like this is going to just be extrapolated at the national level?
We've seen a bit of an exodus already. I would have thought if you were going to step down, you might have done it already. But I mean, it's a kind of party management thing, not a polling thing. So it is perfectly possible. These are an exaggeration of the current position, these by-election results. I don't think every single Conservative MP is going to be looking at their majority and saying, well, throwing up their hands and saying, well, there's no point. I can't defend this seat. There are all sorts of reasons to be sceptical about these by-election results, as well as to say that there are parallels with 1997. So I think we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves and say that all Conservative MPs with majorities less than this will think that the position is hard to defend. And I think quite a lot have already concluded that and looked for work elsewhere anyway. So I don't know. There might be another wave following these.
Okay, so if that's party management, what about the strategy then for the next general election? I mean, some say that Sunak could wait as late as possible in order to call that general election in the hopes maybe of improving the economy. I mean, how do you think about timing?
Yeah, I kind of think timing doesn't matter so much at the moment. What changes between I guess you look at it and say what changes between now and May, what changes between now and November, what changes between now and January 25. Does anything, if not on the assumption that nothing much changes, the timing doesn't really matter that much. And I would have thought there is some advantage in the element of surprise, the element in taking the initiative for a government, because you look at there are a fair number of examples of where governments have taken things to the end of the parliament, and I don't think any of them have been successful. I think 1970 maybe there was a slight, or 1950 perhaps Attlee there was a slight advantage, but really it's not been a strategy that's worked so far.
Well, I mean, one thing that could really change, is really changing, is the war in the Middle East. And presumably that could be an argument for Rishi Sunak to say this leadership is needed for longer than previously thought. I wonder how, distasteful as it is to say, how that would impact polling.
When we look at public opinion and think about how the British public vote in general elections, you have to hold two really different thoughts at the same time. The one is that the public are extremely low information about politics most of the time. Most of the public do not pay attention to politics, don't listen to politics podcasts, and they don't think about politics week to week, day to day.
Tom,
but
you're wrong
there. Sorry. I didn't.
You're not cheering us up, but go ahead, go on.
I think there's enough people out there who really care about politics for for loads of these podcasts and websites to thrive. And boy, is it exciting for those of us who care about it. But I have to tell you, we do focus groups with ordinary voters all the time, and you would be amazed at how little news. Some of them literally actively avoid watching any news at any point, let alone about politics. So there's that thought on the one hand. But when it comes to elections and the public do start to pay attention, the British public are incredibly shrewd and know what is in their best interests. And the reason I'm setting it up like this is that essentially a conflict that's been going on for, depending on when you want to, draw your boundary, but a conflict which has been in the same sort of state for 10 years, 20 years, is not one that is going to change the minds of the British public. And, there are no instances I can think of where the public have kind of fought, or an election has been fought on a kind of foreign policy basis in the post-war period. You can look at Thatcher in 1983 and the bump she got after the Falklands War, but it was more a kind of that became a competence issue. And
but more from the perspective of, I suppose, the only other, again, I mean, it's difficult to think about this, but we had to think about it with Ukraine. It's about oil prices in some senses. It's about the cost of living. I mean, that was a very direct translation of war and its impact on consumers in the UK. I mean, again, we're talking about a war in the Middle East, but I suppose you're saying, with the exception perhaps of that, voters are not going to vote on that.
Yeah, and that's why I set it up in that way. But essentially, it doesn't matter what the outside event, what the external event is. The public are very, very good at deciding whether it's something that is the responsibility of Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. And if it isn't, then neither of them will get credit or blame, and that's particularly important from the government's point of view, from Rishi Sunak's point of view. And I just think you will have to look at the period between now and the election through that lens, that if there are external events, don't get carried away in just reading election outcomes into them. The public are very shrewd about what's going on, who's responsible, and what it means for British politics. And remember that they will almost certainly be voting on domestic issues come the next election.
Yeah. And on that last point then, the next general election, where's your money in terms of when that's going to be called?
I think you get to May next year, both parties will look at the situation and will know everything they need to know. And if you know everything you need to know in May, then I would suggest that you might, as a governing party, call the election, in June, July, to take that initiative, and to avoid sitting essentially on a burning bridge all summer, all autumn, with calls for an election coming from all sides, and suffering from that kind of slow death by a thousand cuts I think John Major suffered in 96-7.
What a call. All right. Tom Lubbock, thanks for sharing those insights with us. Founding Director at JL Partners and member of the superior demographic that listens religiously to politics podcasts.
So now to then the Israeli-Hamas war, in which the UK, of course, is trying to tread a pretty difficult path. There are 7 British nationals confirmed killed in that Hamas attack. But it's also feared that amongst the 9 missing Britons, some of those may also be dead. Here at home, the Metropolitan Police has reported of racially motivated incidents increasing, both anti-Semitic, also Islamophobic. Britain's mainstream politicians have displayed actually remarkable unity when it comes to the war in the Middle East and trying to contain the conflict, limit the conflict. Joining us now to discuss, though, is our UK government reporter, Ellen Milligan. Ellen, the Middle East conflict has been going on a long time, but it has clearly reached a point at which it's having an impact here in the UK. How are tensions actually manifesting in Britain? How bad is the situation for the populations here in the UK?
Well, there's an old saying that goes something like, hostility sleeps lightly, it is easily awakened. And almost every time this long-standing conflict in the Middle East escalates, there is a rise in anti-Semitism and in Islamophobia in the UK and other countries with large Jewish and Muslim communities. As you say, the Met Police says that the reports of anti-Semitic incidents have increased 7-fold. Islamophobic incidents have doubled in these past weeks since the terrorist attack on October 7th. And we've written this story this week, which goes behind those statistics and actually looks at the experiences of both British Jews and Muslims in their own words about those those experiences that they've been facing in recent weeks. We spoke to a rabbi in North London. Some Jews have stopped attending services. Some Jewish schools have closed, or pupils have been told not to wear their blazers, which have badges on them that show that they are Jewish. A rabbi has been spat at. If you walk through parts of North London, which is home to large Jewish communities, there are many ripped posters of the kidnapped Israelis, some of them children. And then in South London, which is home to large Muslim communities, there's a lot of Islamophobic graffiti on bus stops along a route passing primary schools, for example. Muslim girls have been harassed, having their hijabs tweaked. And I thought that was quite, the story ends with a quote from Mike Katz, who's chair of the Jewish Labour Movement, who said, often British Jews and British Muslims are blamed for what happens in the Middle East, and we should make sure that people understand that that should not be the case. And you can't play foreign policy out on the streets of London. And that's the real kind of real world impact that this is having in Britain at the moment.
It's a great feature. It's really worth a read. It's shocking. It's saddening stuff. Just thinking about the politics of this, Ellen, Rishi Sunak in some ways has got a less difficult time than Keir Starmer, in that Keir Starmer has had councillors resigning over his response to the war in the Middle East. Why has that happened, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, globally, there's definitely more of a focus on what the language that Sunak uses. Obviously, the UK is an important part of this diplomatic management of this situation, but at home, there's definitely more of a focus, people clinging on to every word of Keir Starmer's. And that's because the Labour Party is less united on this issue. The pro-Palestine movement tends to sit on the left of the political spectrum, where the Labour Party obviously sits also. But I think the main reason for that is the Labour Party's recent history of anti-Semitism under Starmer's predecessor, Corbyn. In 2020, the Equality and Human Rights Commission found the Labour Party under Corbyn breached the Equality Act by its handling of complaints of anti-Semitism, which Corbyn then failed to accept those findings in full and was suspended, and he now sits as an independent MP. So I think Keir Starmer early on was under more pressure to condemn this terrorist attack and to express support for Israel. The way that manifested, though, is in an interview which has angered some members of his party, in particular when Keir Starmer said this on LBC.
I'm very clear. Israel does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself and Hamas bears responsibility.
And Starmer did have a much more balanced approach at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. Some would say an attempt to correct those comments, in which he suggested that it was right for Israel to cut off humanitarian aid to Gaza. At PMQs, he stressed the need to minimize civilian casualties and allow aid into Gaza. The word he used was immediately, which is actually slightly stronger language than Sunak. But I think the damage is already done in terms of some members, some Labour councillors resigning. This pro-Palestine rally this morning outside Labour HQ. This LBC interview is the thing they're pointing at, even if he has used more balanced language since then.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth bearing in mind that, whilst we are focusing on this issue, the impact in the UK shouldn't be overestimated. I think a great many people are making a lot of efforts to make sure that the sorts of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that the Met has reported are not exacerbated, don't get worse. But I think you're right that the issue also around how this is played out on social media is hugely important. I mean, we're talking to Dr. Julie Norman this morning about that, Jane Kinnamont from Chatham House too. Everybody is pointing to the fact that it's also online. If more very explicit imagery comes online, that is very difficult. I want to also pick up on Humza Yousaf, of course, the Scottish First Minister, who's also been very much at the centre of how the UK is seeing what's going on in Gaza, because, of course, his parents-in-law, the parents of his wife, are trapped in Gaza at the moment. And he's talked about UK ministers abandoning Britons trapped in Gaza. There are significant concerns, aren't there, about how the UK government handles this?
Yeah, Humza Yousaf's leadership on this has been remarkable in the past weeks. He's obviously been personally impacted by the conflict, has had to handle his own party's annual conference with his first speech as First Minister at that conference this week. And in the first, while he was dealing with the tragedy of his parents-in-law being stuck in Gaza, he visited Jewish communities and Muslim communities in Glasgow, which is also home to large Jewish and Muslim communities. He met with the parents of someone British Israeli who was killed as well. I think at the moment, before a ground invasion has begun, you're seeing a diplomatic push, particularly from Joe Biden, but also from Sunak, who was obviously in Israel yesterday, to maybe pass on privately their caution to Netanyahu to kind of don't mess this up, don't let civilian casualties mount up. We support your right to defend against future attacks against Hamas, but there is that caution. And Bloomberg had an overnight story about the perhaps a slight change in approach from Israel after their meeting with Biden. But if that ground invasion does take place, what response are we going to see from Starmer and Sunak in response to those Gazan casualties?
Ellen, thank you so much for being with us. Bloomberg's UK government reporter, Ellen Milligan. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. You can give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more next week. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.